This is going to be the beginning of our Partners Forum. It's a little bit of an open mic exercise. With that being said, I'm going to hand over this mic over to Ben. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ali John. Well, dear friends and colleagues, these are the Istanbul Development Dialogues, and dialogues involve many voices, and to some extent we've constrained ourselves through having panels and people standing up here, sitting up here, and haven't taken advantage of all of the different experiences, voices, and partnership opportunities that are in the hall. And as long as we've had the Istanbul Development Dialogues, and this is now the 5th year in a row that we've done them, we've always had a Partners Forum. And the Partners Forum is a chance for you, UNDP's partners and members of the audience that haven't yet officially participated in the, if you like, holding the microphone, participating in the dialogues, to do so. For the remainder, essentially, of the afternoon until the concluding session, that's what we're going to do. Now, the Partners Forum essentially consists of 3 different pieces. Okay. The first is we're very pleased we're going to have a dedicated session by a very important partner, FAO, the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, which is going to be talking about family farms, rural development, and financing the SDGs. This is very important for many reasons. One of them is that when we talk about finance and banks, we oftentimes end up in cities, whereas in fact, as has been pointed out, so much poverty and vulnerability is in rural areas that involves around getting more and better financing into the agricultural sector and farm households. Then we're going to have for second, what might be called a panel of partners, which will consist of representatives of UN volunteers, from the UN in Moldova, talking about blended finance, and especially remittances, and the role remittances can play in financing sustainable development. That's extremely important, and we haven't yet discussed that. We're going to have a representative of Land Berlin, which does credit guarantee funds in Europe as well as in Tajikistan and in Afghanistan. And if circumstances allow, we will have a short presentation on new developments in financing of social contracting with community-based organizations. And then last but not least, we're going to have an open mic where anyone who wants to briefly stand up from the audience to say very briefly what they're doing on financing sustainable development will have the chance to do so. The mic will be given to you, and you can let us know what's happening from your perspective, or if you would like to make a comment on what you've heard, this is also an opportunity. So we're shaking it up, we're opening things up, and doing things a little bit differently. So that's what the Partners Forum is all about. Okay. So moving into the first phase, I would like to ask our colleagues from FAO to come up and join us. And I would like in particular to pass the floor to Mr. Raymond Jelle, if I've pronounced your name correctly. And if I haven't, please forgive me. I'll keep working on it.
Thank you, Ben. I should be heard with
okay.
the headset. Very good. Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. We're very pleased from FAO point of view to have this space and to be able to have a dedicated session talking about agriculture. While the panelists are coming, let me just quickly also set a bit the scene. First of all, just to introduce myself, I'm Raymond Jelle. I'm the Regional Program Leader for Europe and Central Asia, based in Budapest. And we have heard a lot about investment into development and supporting also the SDGs. We covered also various sectors throughout the discussions in the last 2 days, and we touched also in several cases on agriculture. We heard IFAD this morning, but we talked also about bonds, and so there has been many areas where we talked about, and as Ben was also mentioning, but achieving the SDGs with agriculture or without agriculture is something which we would say is very difficult, because as you know, most of the rural poor live in rural areas, and most of these poor people are really engaged in agriculture, and thus we have really a strong contribution of them to achieve the SDGs. Now, the session, as we said, is going to talk about investing into agriculture, family farming, and smallholders, because these are the backbones of the rural area. So we have, in fact, three key areas which we want to talk about. And of course, investment in agriculture is a key one, because we have heard figures this morning of we need annually 140 billion. We have heard a figure which is 180 billion. There is also, if you open the internet, you find a figure of 225. It doesn't matter which figure now I would say is correct. The importance is a lot of money and a lot of investment is needed. We have heard when we talked about infrastructure that there is no shortage of money, so we just have to use it. So we are not entirely sure how this is related to agriculture, but it's not only a question of, let's say, the amount, but it's also a question that we need a better one. We need better investment in agriculture in order to be able to benefit the livelihoods, the environment, and also to cater for the needs of the community. So we need really a responsible investment, and we need to minimize the risks for the actors. So responsible investment has been also a couple of days ago emphasized again by the G20 meeting in Japan, where particular reference was made to the voluntary guidelines for land tenure and also trade, but also the FAO OECD guidelines on responsible agriculture food chains. So really creating with investment decent work, investing in infrastructure and healthy soils, as well as facilitating the investment for smallholders is a key one. Second is, of course, taking the importance of the needs into consideration. The private sector plays a key role. With this enormous dimension, we really need to get the private sector on board, and we need to blend the public and the private finance in order to make this also happen. So there is an enormous potential. We have heard over the last 2 days what kind of opportunities we have, but we have to exploit it, and we have also to facilitate it. The third issue which we want to emphasize also in the discussion today is social protection, because one of the areas of public finance and also investment which is really particularly underdeveloped is related to agriculture and also its social protection part. Social protection has been recognized. We have talked, we have heard about it, but not necessarily from the perspective of agriculture, as a critical measure to really reduce the rural poverty, and is building also food security. So we want to put the light into some of these areas with the discussion. So the three key messages which the panel wants to pass on in this remaining maybe 50 minutes is: responsible investment is critical for enhancing the food security. The role of the private sector is to accelerate the transformation in agriculture, and the investment in social protection is a means to increase also the resilience. So I want to discuss this with the three distinguished panelists. I mean, it's a small panel, but nevertheless, small, I think, is beautiful. And in this case, I very much welcome, first of all, Ms. Fatma Can Shaklik. She's from the Sütaş Grubu company here in Turkey. And the Sütaş Grubu company is one of the leading dairy companies in Turkey. It's amongst the 50 biggest companies of Turkey. And she's the corporate affairs coordinator. And I think she's the best person to talk about some of these aspects of the private sector. Next to Fatma is Natalia Vindorossi. She's the team leader for social protection of FAO headquarters, and as a senior officer, I think the most important person in order to talk about some of these issues. And last but not least, on the left hand is Mr. Munknazan Tsevegmet. He comes from the Ministry of Agriculture of Mongolia, from the livestock department, and I think this gives us a good overview, particularly from some of the public institutions who are dealing also with the aspects of social protection. Now, the panel discussion, of course, if we compare this also with the panels we had throughout the 2 days, comprises certainly also of perspectives from the social and from the public, let's say, panel, so public officers, and that, I think, gives a different dimension into the discussion of this important event. Let me, in this case, ask the three panelists for a quick introduction, let's say, statement to understand a bit what they stand for. So, Fatma, please.
Thank you. At least we are a small group of panelists, but at least we achieved gender equality in the podium, as you see. All of you know that agriculture is very important, and sustainability, achieving sustainability in agricultural production especially is very important, considering the rate of population increase and also the demand for food. So we have to change our food and agricultural system in order to obtain the achieve the sustainability in that regard. This can be done only with the contribution of farmers and also agri-food industry, because we are agri-food industry, we are dependent on thousands and thousands of farmers who can do something in terms of sustainability. So I will be talking about our experience in that respect in particular during the panel.
Natalia.
So one minute, can you hear me okay? Yes. So 1 minute elevator speech. I think if we are serious about really accelerating progress around SDG 1 and 2, and I will argue also 8, 13 and 16, there has to be a very explicit investment in rural areas, because it's where the gap is, as we've heard this morning and also with Raymond's remarks. But also we think that there's a lot of the potential. Most of those that produce food, that are managing food systems are in the agriculture sector and are small-scale producers. We also know that we have to invest in making the agriculture sector a driving sector, investing in new technologies, particularly to be able to address the risk around climate change. But we also have to have a specific effort in making these investments much more inclusive and moving towards inclusive agricultural transformation. And there is where the role of social protection is very key, trying to make sure that it ensures this inclusive approach. So throughout this panel, I would like to make a very strong economic case for social protection, not only as a social policy and its distributional impact, but also as a key element to enhance the economic and productive potential of the poorest. Thank you.
Munkatsan.
Thank you. Here I'm just representing one of the developing country, so I would like to just introduce my country, what is the main sector of the economic sector of the country. So Mongolia is the one landlocked country in Central Asia, covering with the 150 million square area and hosting only 3.2 million people. and to 75% of the country's territory used for the common pasture, and we have the 1/3 of the population is really dependent on that pasture, and also that pasture and livestock sector is providing income generation for the half of the national population. So our government is seeing that the social protection of the local people, including especially the herdermen who raise the animals and earn their main income from the animal husbandry, is the key to achieve the sustainable goal and increase and decrease the poverty in the country. So in this final, I will be talking about more than what our government is doing and what are the benefits of that policy implementation. So thank you.
Before we are talking again about also the private sector and particularly the issue of social protection, let me spend still a couple of minutes on the issue of responsible agriculture investment, because this is from our point of view certainly a key one. And when we talk about responsible agriculture investment, or how we call it also RAI, it's essential really to enhance the food security and the nutrition situation. Now, if we are of course talking also about the region, the dimensions of food security and nutrition are certainly very different, but just putting in the issue of triple burden of malnutrition is a key area which also needs to be addressed further, and investment into agriculture has here also an important role to play, because the contribution of responsible agriculture investment is really to enhance sustainable livelihoods, and particularly to facilitate also the investment for the smallholders and the vulnerable groups, because with vulnerable groups and particularly also smallholders having better access also to the market, there is also the possibility to create further opportunities for investment. It means certainly also to facilitate creating decent work for all, and thus a strong contribution to eradicate also poverty and fostering as well social and gender equality. As you probably know, the guidelines for responsible agriculture investment have been defined already in 2014 by the Global Committee on World Food Security, and they also have a strong focus on considering youth and the cultural heritage, as well as also biodiversity. When we talk about responsible agriculture investment, we are just not talking about the economic dimension, but we are talking really about investments into food systems. So food systems in this context really means that we're talking about economic, environmental, and also the social dimension for this investment. And it's also quite important to really respecting, protecting, and also promoting a human rights approach. So what is really important in that context, that we still lack awareness of responsible investment, and we have quite a lot of information gaps when it comes to this in the region, but of course also globally. Two points which I wanted to make also on the responsible agriculture investment is to give you an example in order to have also a better understanding. And this is the first one. I want to use Ukraine, where a couple of years ago we had the situation that 2008 Ukraine introduced a green export quota, and this resulted that most of the private sectors active in grain production were in principle backing out, and it created really considerable problems. With the establishment of, for example, a working group with the private and the public sectors, so facilitating the policy dialogue, and therefore really helping to increase transparency and better information exchange, resulted in the end into the elimination of the ban, and overall over time we can in the meantime estimate that around 1 billion of investment was really here facilitated for the agriculture sector in the Ukraine. And another example which I also want to give is, for example, investment in geographical indication, which in fact results in introducing of quality, and therefore it facilitates opportunities for further investment also from the private sector. EBRD and FAO have worked here in the case of Serbia, and it has really helped to facilitate for also smallholders new access of markets, and therefore increasing also the income of the rural population. Last, what I just also want to mention is the point of blended finance. Blended finance has been put on the table in the discussion also today and yesterday, and really from an FAO point of view, we are not the ones who are providing in that sense blended finance, but we are supporting the alignment of blended finance with investment with the SDGs in the way that we are repackaging also our existing technical guidance and materials, and we are supporting to monitor the SDG compliance in investment. So these are the key areas when we talk about responsible agriculture investment and when we talk also about blended finance. But let me turn in that sense now also to Fatma from the point of view of the private sector. And so we highlighted the importance of investment and for achievement also the SDGs. What would you say is the really experience from the perspective of Sütaş in this context? And maybe can you provide some examples how you are supporting it?
Thank you, Emmanuel. So I will be speaking about social investment, economic investment, and environmental investments that we are doing in Sütaş. First of all, I have to give you some clue about our company. We are a vertically integrated company, let's say. We are producing fodder crops, compound feeds, and we have farms. We are producing raw milk, and of course we are processing this raw milk. But originally, Sütaş is established as a milk processing company. So the other activities, of course, are developed and just included later on. So what this, you may ask that if you are vertically integrated, so why you are talking about this rural communities, SDGs, rural population problems, and small farmers, etc. We are still dependent on thousands and thousands of farmers. We are currently processing 1/10 of milk going to industry in Turkey, but we are, I mean, our production can meet only 5% of the raw milk that we process currently. So we completely dependent on the farmers producing milk for us. Of course, many of them are small farmers. They are some of them are under cooperatives, but some of them are individuals. So we are completely dependent on these farmers. In the region, generally, you know, agriculture is very important in terms of GDP, share in the GDP and also share in employment. This is, I mean, Turkey is also the same. 7% of GDP is coming from agriculture, agri-food industry, let's say, and it employs about 20% of the people in Turkey. So it is very important in social terms. I mean, agriculture plays an important role, but we are facing with the same problems that the world faces. So, you know, there is a very high rate of urbanization in the world, and in Turkey it is much more higher than the world averages. So in the rural areas there are the number of people living in rural areas are decreasing, and the rural areas are generally the areas, the population who are dealing with agriculture. So we really have some big problems in Turkey as well, and as Sütaş we also have some problems. So what we have currently, we have to increase the production, not only milk of course, we have to increase the agricultural production on a very limited size of land and with less people, with less farmers. So this is of course a very, very big dilemma for any company in the world, and in particular agri-food companies in the world and also in Turkey. So in order to increase the production of agricultural products, in our case dairy, and also of course the feed materials, so we have to, the natural resources are damaged, not in the world, in Turkey as well. So we have to increase the productivity of agricultural production, let's say. So this can be done only with know-how and experience and information given to the farmers. So in that respect, what we do as a part of our social investment, as I told you, we are vertically integrated. We are experienced in plant production and feed production and dairy production. So what we do, we try to share our experience we gained in our farms with the farmers that we work. That's why we established training centers in 2 locations in Turkey right now. And in these locations, we provide free of charge trainings to the farmers, dairy farmers, whether they supply milk to us or not, it doesn't make any difference. So we do provide them training, and in order to increase their productivity and increase their milk yield. So what we see after these trainings, we see that our farmers' milk yield increased about 12% since, for 3 years. So we are very happy that this can, of course, this will facilitate our rural communities, our farmers, income stability, and also it will increase their livelihoods. So this is one of our part in social investment. This is also important. In the dairy sector, it is quite different than the plant product side, because in dairy sector, we have to call, animals produce milk every day. So they don't give any break in the weekends or Easters or Christmas or Ramadan festives. So they continue producing milk, and the milk provides monthly income for the dairy farmers. So this is very important for the rural communities, for their incomes and increasing their, making their livelihoods. This is one of our investments in the social area. In the economic investments, we, in Turkey currently we have 3 facilities in 3 different regions. We are originally in Marmara region, in Bursa. And the second plant we opened in Aksaray region. I will give you very nice figures in that for our facility there. So we opened that facility in 2008, officially in 2009. What we saw, the milk production in that area tripled in 5 years, and also we are contributing 20% of GDP of that area. I mean, Sütaş contribution to GDP of that area is 20%. So this is, I mean, new investments in the agri-food industry is very important in stimulating the economic activities and also the income of that, those regions. Now currently we are investing in the eastern part of Turkey, which will be a quite big one, and we will be having there very big farms as well. But it is very important to see that in that region, the entrepreneurs are starting to invest in the small or medium-sized farms. So in order, I mean, when we open our facility over there, so we will not have, of course, enough milk to process over there, but there are some initiatives that the farmers are trying to invest in that area, which also make the life in that region, I mean, much more, of course, how to say, it is becoming interesting and exciting in that region, I mean, agricultural production. So it is also very important for the sustainability of agricultural production, I mean, in continuing the production in that area. The third investment that Sütaş plays in Turkey, I'm making it very short, is in the area of environment. You know, we are big farms and we have animal manure that we have to manage somehow. So animal manure is very important. It causes climate greenhouse gas. So what we are doing, we are trying to use this very important and very good source of energy and nutrient, let's say, to produce electricity, and then of course to change it to the organic fertilizer. That we use these fertilizers on the land that we that we produce plants. What we see, just to give you a figure, with good management of water resources and use of this organic fertilizer, we were able to increase our plant production 30%. So what we try to do right now, we are trying to expand this expertise and information to our farmers and increase the agricultural production and also increase the profitability of our farmers.
Fatma, I think this was a clear indication of how supporting SDG 2 when we talk about productivity, but of course also SDG 15. Now, of course, your, let's say, farmers are business oriented. They are, I think they are able to really take on board probably also loans, credits in order to grow. Now, the other side is, of course, when we talk about vulnerable groups in rural areas where they do not have these spaces. So how do we look into that, and how do we mobilize here investment into, for example, social protection systems to move on this? Natalia, I would like to ask you, what are probably here examples, or what are the key issues which we would need to take into consideration?
Sure. So when you ask me why is it key to mobilize resources on social protection, usually my first reaction, well, social protection is a right. So in order to realize those rights, we need to invest in those. I usually also talk about the social justice and the role of social protection as a redistribution mechanism. And I think some of that was discussed the first day when we talked about the impact of pensions in Latin America. But there is an argument that sometimes we forget, which is the economic case, the investment case around social protection. How do we enhance the capacity of farmers, particularly the small scale, the vulnerable, to be able to effectively contribute to their economies? It does make economic sense to enhance social security and social protection systems in rural areas. And this is not just a concept or rationale because one day I woke up and we woke up and thought that was important, but this is backed up with really strong evidence around showing that a social program, such as social protection, and we're talking about insurance, cash transfers, so school feeding, and others, can definitely help to, one, accelerate accumulation of human capital, so allow people to really access education and health services, and therefore, in the long run, enhance their employability, their skills. And we've seen very strong results from short-term, but also from long-term impacts of programs that have been established for already 10 or 15 years, and we see the impacts of these investments from children and now to adolescent employability. Key and very clear impacts around food security. Families are now able, that have access to social protection are able to have access to more and better food, to more diverse and healthy diet, which is of course a key component, a key strategy around SDG 2. It's not that families do not know what to eat, but sometimes the availability of nutritious and healthy food is not there, or the purchasing power to access those healthy diets is not available. It's also key in order to, as a risk management strategy, which in the agriculture sector is key. You know, the agriculture sector is very risk by nature. It's exposed to price fluctuations, to impacts of climate change, and having access to some sort of a stable safety net allows farmers to be able to smooth consumption, to plan, to invest, and to be able to manage that risk in a much more sustainable manner. And also minimize some of the negative coping mechanisms that many of these families are unfortunately forced to resort to in the event of crisis, such as selling off of productive assets or decreasing the health nature of their diet or engaging their children in child labor, for instance. In the context of climate change, we've been doing a lot of research in the role of social protection, not only in addressing or mitigating the negative impacts of the damage and loss that climate-related risks generate in the agriculture sector, but also in changing livelihoods. How do we make agricultural livelihoods much more climate smart? How do we support and address some of the economic and social barriers to transition from low productive, low skill, and low risk agriculture investment to other types of programs? And you may have heard about a newly approved Green Climate Fund project in Paraguay in South America called PROESA, where precisely the social protection program, the national cash transfer program, has been top up as a way to motivate or promote or facilitate the move of the poorest sectors of the agriculture sector towards more sustainable practices in the agroforestry sector. And this is, you know, in a nutshell, when we're talking about social assistance types interventions, so social protection programs that are usually targeted to the poor and trying to enhance risk management and access to basic services. But even for those that are already engaged in commercial activities, other types of social protection, such as insurance, becomes a key way of definitely managing risk and helping to make a stronger commitment to riskier investments and therefore more productive investments. We made also a lot of discussions around how do we make a much more stronger case for prevention, preparedness, and early action, and to what extent we can use existing social protection systems to be able to better deliver humanitarian action when needed, but most importantly, to be able to deliver early action based on forecast-based financing. Can we use a blended financing, but not in the way that we've been talking about, but using the big resources available in the development and the humanitarian sector to be able to make social protection systems much more risk-informed and shock responsive. One key point that I wanted to make is around the affordability of social protection and the different perspectives around, is it affordable? We're in a context where there is a new forms of employment. We have an increasingly aging population across regions. We have a different base in terms of contributory capacity. We have a accelerated pace in terms of informality, which of course is key in the agriculture sector. What is the implication of that in terms of affordability? I think a first point is that the affordability of social protection is first and foremost a political decision. And many countries, many low-income countries even, have been put and committed to put their own budgets and their own commitments and investment to expanding the scale, the reach, and the impact of social protection programs across regions, not just, Philippines, Zambia, Lesotho, Kenya, Brazil. Many countries have really committed with the understanding of seeing social protection not as an additional budget cost, but as a key investment around enhancing the employability and the human capacity of the poorest. But I think also, and I think where a lot of the discussions around what is the role of the private sector in its broad definition can come into play. How do we bring together different financing mechanisms to, one, enhance the efficiency of social protection systems to better respond to the new demands of this new employment sector and labor dynamics? Can we think about, a lot of the examples that we've seen about private and public partnerships in terms of insurance? And I think our colleague from Mongolia is going to discuss a little bit about how has that come into play and what has been the incentives of a government as well as of a private company to come together to provide a much more efficient way to access social protection. How do we make the ways of contributing to those working in the rural sector much more flexible? Social security systems have been designed from a classic labor market paradigm, which is really reflecting how the urban labor markets function and not necessarily how the rural ones. Can we make sure that we can have innovative financing to change the ways that we're contributing and therefore make the access to social protection more clear and efficient to those in the rural sector? And when we talk about private sector, one last point, if I may, Raymond, is thinking also of the broader actors, also looking at farmers' organizations, cooperatives, civil society, and the role that they also play in facilitating access to key social programs and social protection mechanisms. In many contexts, the government has not been able to reach rural areas, and its cooperatives and rural organizations, the ones that have been innovative in providing dedicated support. Can we learn from those experiences? Can we strengthen that expertise to be able to have a much more comprehensive and adequate coverage of social protection in rural areas? And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Производительного населения.
Let's, in principle, go from FAO guidance direction.
Какие у нас имеются практические примеры от ФАО? Вот мы сказали, я слышали, что в Монголии мы слышали, что население получило адекватный доступ к различным инвестициям и различным фондам, которые можно получить через посредство ФАО. Что вы могли бы сказать по этому поводу? Как вы можете объяснить, почему вы в Монголии с удовольствием принимаете инвестиции? Да, спасибо большое. Очень большое количество нашего населения работает в сельском хозяйстве, и сейчас, конечно, максимальная защита интересов нашего населения, социальных интересов.
Called the Mongolian Sustainable Development Vision to 2030, which is reflecting to the sustainable goals. So within this sustainable development strategy, our government, our parliament is making some more the policies which is subsidizing the social protection service and the health service and education service of the local people. Then by the 2018, the almost nearly 35% of the national annual budget was spent on for the social protection in this health service and education service for the subsidizing. So that I would like to mention some of the activities which are our government is taking for the poverty reduction implementation.
Can I just interrupt one question which you may then also add in that sense? Would you say Mongolia would have done this anyway with or without the SDGs?
Sorry?
Would have Mongolia invested into this without SDGs being agreed or because of the SDGs?
Yeah, do you know that the Mongolia, that some 25 years ago, the Mongolia was a socialist country, and during the 1990s, the socialist area was just closed. During that close, the animals were privatized to the herders, and the herders get lost their social protection. So after that the new economic and political situation, most of the population just left behind the social protection and left behind the country's policy. So then Mongolia decided to create a national policy for the herders to protect the local people, and they were kind of before the SDGs, only 10% of the local herders, let me say herders, they were covered by the social protection service. And after the development goals, and the Mongolian government approved the new the long-term policy, and it has increased by 18%. So now the almost 35% of the herders are covered by the basic social service. And what we are doing is the government is paying, the government is subsidizing 50% of the social insurance premium of the local herders. Why we are doing this? The herders doesn't have a regular monthly income. They have only two times a year to earn the money from the livestock. The one is the spring, because they bump the cashmeres from the goat, and then the second one is in the winter time. They slaughter the animal, then they sell them. That's why the government is paying only the 50% of that social insurance premium. And also we have almost 20% of the herders are aged people, which is pension. And now government is decided to reduce the pension age by 5 years. Today, the people, the male and female herders can retire at the age of 55 and 50 respectively. And also the government is subsidizing the free of charge education, high school education for the herders' children. They're also paying for the accommodation and also paying for the meal in the accommodation for whole year. And also those things, those activities under our government brought our country some benefits. I would like to say something, some numbers and statistics. After that, those policies, our poverty is reduced by 15%. And the number of social insurance bought the herders increased by 18%. And the 70% of the poor people in a rural area covered by the social insurance services. So those activities, those actions brought our country ranked in the high human development category in a human development index in 2015. So generally speaking, the government subsidizing the social protection service is a kind of a good way to protect the local people. What the local people are not only the poor ones. They are the private sector actually, because they own animals. At least the one herder owns hundreds of animals. They are producing some more products. In Mongolians we are saying like to say that we are producing somehow organic products, because we are using the natural pasture and natural plants. And those herders are producing meat, milk, and some other livestock-related products. So what we need is that we need to invest the money into creating a market for the local herders, where they can bring their raw materials and where they can bring their raw materials and get the money. This will be very beneficial for our herders if they have there's this kind of unit or kind of company who is dealing with the raw materials of the livestock. They can earn money for the whole year, not 2 times a year, and they can also pay their social insurance per annum. They can pay. Yeah, then so this can also the Mongolian government is saying that for this reason, the local people are more vulnerable to the national disaster and also the very shock of the global commodity price. Our government is kind of proposing to establish international year on the pasture and pastoralists. Why we are proposing this is the local people, we just put the public attention into the local and herder men. This proposal is almost ready. This will be submitted to the FAO headquarters in very soon in July or June. So I think that's...
Yeah, so International Year of the Pastoralist, I think this is certainly something which very much helps to raise also awareness. I mean, the International Decade of Family Farming, which we are just starting, is also one of these elements. I think very good. We had, I think, a clear answer from Mongolia. The investment into social protection was really facilitated by the SDGs. I think this is a very good confirmation. We also have a good understanding from Natalia how social protection can really facilitate, and also the engagement of the private sector, which Fatma was outlining. I'm using at the moment of time. I'm not sure if the audience is having some questions or some comments on this. Any reaction or any, I mean, as I understand, of course, from the point of view, there are also possibilities later on, but if there are any questions specifically to the audience, if not, then I will turn, of course, back to the panelists, because one of the questions which I certainly also would like to raise is, of course, what do we in fact expect in terms of the institutional requirements or the obstacles when we talk about the investment into the agriculture. So how would you, Fatma, really look at this from the point of view of your company? What do you expect in the end from the public sector in order to facilitate this also better?
We are talking about general farms. Agri-food companies have capital to invest. Of course, sometimes we are using some incentives from the government to invest, let's say. But the most investment is required by the farmers, because they are the most vulnerable people, even because of the nowadays demographic challenges. The urbanization and the rural communities, there are the farming community is aging, and it is also very difficult for them to access to finance because of their age. Most incentives or investments should go to farmers, of course, in order to invest in the farming.
So, sorry, would that mean if you said the farmers are aging, so with the social protection measure, yes, you would in principle take the farmers out of their productive, let's say?
Not exactly. Aging population means, I mean, we are in a digital age right now. The age people or farmers cannot use or cannot benefit from the digital technology, let's say. So we have to provide them some kind of information, knowledge, and also we have to provide them some finance, because their access to finance is limited when you compare with the youth people. So this is one of the problems. In Turkey, when I look at Turkey, of course, we have some investment programs that the farmers can invest in milk farms, for example, or meat, for production of meat. So there are some funds available, but of course this must be accelerated and increased somehow. You know, if we want to achieve the production level for the future, we have to invest too much in the agriculture as well. So the people, I mean, we have to create more resilient agricultural systems and more resilient, of course, farmers.
Natalia, what would you say is one of the key issues, institutional requirements?
Maybe a couple of points. One is around addressing some of the unfortunate myths or policy concerns around social protection and around poverty. The disincentives to labor, the fact that people become dependent on social protection, and a lot of governments are trying to change that and trying to make a stronger case about, actually, no, people are investing these resources and the result is not dependency, but a contribution to make the local economies more dynamic. And that's a way of also reinvesting in capacity. There are issues, however, if we think and we understand social protection as a contribution to SDG 1 and 2 or others that are really asking us to work in a multi-sectoral perspective. What are the incentives to bring the different ministries and the different stakeholders, private and public, to work together in an efficient and coordinated way? What are the incentives for the Ministry of Agriculture to put part of their budget lines in expanding social protection to rural areas? What is the incentive of a civil society group to be part of the accountability mechanisms of the establishment of a social protection program? How do we create incentives for private companies to be able to also integrate farmers that they are able and wanting to contribute into a potential social insurance mechanism? It's interesting to see, you know, that we have a lot of documents that talk about multi-sectoral coordination. I think we do have to do a better job in creating very concrete incentives for that coordination to happen. We've talked a lot about the potential contribution of the private sector, and I think in social protection there's a lot of entry points for that contribution, without, of course, taking out the responsibility of governments to be the main providers of social protection, and as well of civil society and public and private organizations to be able to serve an accountability role, to be able to make sure that these programs are adequately reached, adequately covered, and adequately used. No? So I do think that there's the Agenda 2030 gave us a very strong commitment to bring different actors together. We still need to continue incentivizing and defining those very concrete incentives for that coordination to happen.
Mugata, would you have any specific issue on institutional requirements from your perspective? What you would like to highlight? Very shortly, because I see the clock is ticking in front of us. The audience doesn't see it, but we see it. So in that sense, very quickly. Maybe they should see also the clock.
Yeah. Miss Fatima said that the herdsmen and the families are aging, so this is also an issue for us. And the younger generation of the herders tend to be living in urban areas. In urban areas in our country, it's very difficult to find a job. So if the people are just migrating from the rural areas to the urban, we are also having more poverty. Not to decrease the poverty, we will have more poverty in urban areas. So our government is seeking that the more is smarter or some approach to convince the younger generation to become a herding man. So that's why maybe we are very happy to use the recommendation of this conference, this this conference to how to introduce the more high technology to the herding in agriculture sector. Also, some innovations, how to make the herding is more easy and profitable. If the herding is profitable in rural areas, the younger generation will attract to that business. The herding is a kind of business, not a kind, it's really business. So we are just seeking something kind of institutional or technical assistance into the agriculture sector.
Well, the issue of technology and, of course, also innovations is something which has been also discussed quite intensively. We are coming closely to the end. Last statement from each of you in terms of coming back to your initial key message, Fatma?
Industry and agriculture sector is facing with, has many challenges ahead for the future. So these challenges cannot be addressed alone by the private sector or by the farmers or by other institutions. So cooperation is required from anybody involved in this process. For achieving the SDGs, of course, it's very important cooperation. Maybe the SDG 17 is the most important one in that respect. So we have to work together in order to keep the agricultural production going on and in order to produce more agricultural products to meet the demands of the future generations. And we have to work together. This is what I would like to give as a message.
Natalia?
I think how I started, that rural areas should not be, investment in rural areas should not be an afterthought, but actually an explicit priority in the Agenda 2030. Not something that is added as a comma, but something that governments, private sector, and others are really targeting. And when we think about agriculture investments, looking at the diverse types of investment that are needed to enhance the productivity, the climate resistance, as well as the inclusiveness to make sure that those that are in charge of most of our production can have access to new technologies and practices.
Yeah, personally, I believe that the sustainable development and sustainable development goals are means that the means that to me is that the herders or the local people or no one should stay behind of that sustainable development. It should bring some benefit to all the people, and especially the local ones, especially the pastoralist people must benefit from this long-term global policy or policy strategy. We are just trying to convince all the people to invest in that very marginalized people. So.
I very much like that you put your emphasis in your last statement really on the pastoralist, on the people on the ground, and I think this is particular when we look at it from an SDG implementation point of view, where probably there is still a lot to go. So as our time is up, I would like to thank particularly you as a panelist for this interesting discussion, and I hope we were able to pass on the message to the audience when we talk about responsible agriculture investment, the linkage also to social protection, and the importance here of the private sector to get a good understanding how multidimensional the agriculture sector is related to its contribution to the SDGs. So thank you very much again, and thank you for the opportunity to UNDP.
Well, thank you very much, Raimund, and FAO colleagues, and our colleague from Shutash, whose products I consume regularly, and from Mongolia. I think I would make two observations to tie what we've just heard right to the center of our discussion. The first is about financing sustainable development from state budgets. We heard so much about social protection, and social protection is clearly critical if we're serious about leaving no one behind. But in so many middle-income countries, especially lower middle-income countries of Europe and Central Asia, social protection is underfunded, and the underfunding problem is getting worse. State pension funds, state health insurance funds are increasingly underfunded, meaning that there's not enough resources to meet the obligations in them. And as these societies age, and as more and more workers either emigrate abroad or work in the informal sector, in part because the Social Security taxes are so high to try to make the funds sustainable, there's even more and more pressure on these funds. And I think this is a critical aspect of finance for sustainable development. And it's especially a problem in lower middle income countries like Ukraine, like Moldova, where we have aging, shrinking populations, very large informal sectors, and relatively low per capita income levels. Not a lot of ability to pay taxes, and not a lot of disposable income in a lot of houses. So I'm very grateful to our colleagues for emphasizing the importance of social protection from a finance for development perspective. And the second aspect that's so important, of course, is the spatial dimensions. It's so easy to get excited about the new possibilities for financial technologies and, you know, the cashless economy and the new possibilities for development that come with all of this. But this is all in the capital cities, or maybe in a few commercial centers, like Almaty or Istanbul, okay, or St. Petersburg. But it's not in the rural areas. It's not in the smaller towns, right? And that also is about rural development, regional development, leaving no one behind. We have to get the financial systems of middle-income countries to extend the benefits of the financial technological revolutions to the smaller towns, to the rural areas. You know, now arguably in an OECD country where you only have 5 or 10% of the population in rural areas working in agriculture, we're not talking about that many people. But in a country like Mongolia, where 20 or 25% of the population is engaged in agriculture, living in rural areas, as we heard from our colleague from Mongolia, this is a big chunk of people. Likewise in a country like Ukraine, Moldova, again. So thank you, FAO colleagues, for calling our attention to this, and we need to remember that leaving no one behind is very much about leaving no one in rural and agricultural areas behind, as well as in cities. Okay, on that note, let's now begin the second part of the Partners Forum, which is the Partners Panel. And at this moment, I would like to invite Nils Memisholu from the UN Volunteers to come up and join us on the stage. I would like to invite Michael Pelia from UNDP to come up and join us on the stage. And I would like to invite Bernd Leidner from Land Berlin, managing partner, to come up and join us on the stage. We'll have short presentations by each of you and a short panel discussion, and then we'll open things up for questions and comments. So please, well, I see some of our colleagues are here. Okay. And for those of you who have PowerPoint presentations, as long as they're short, I have the magic instrument. Okay, I would like, since Nils is, as I understand it, not here, I would like to ask Michael to start. Let me just give a brief introduction. We've heard an awful lot about finance, about private sector finance, about banks, about foreign direct investment, and about the government. But we haven't heard very much about remittances. And yet in many countries of the world, remittances are much bigger than foreign direct investment, much bigger than bank lending from abroad, much, much bigger than ODA. And the question is, can we blend this, the remittance finances, with other sources of finance to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? And in Moldova, we have some very interesting results in this respect, projects done by a number of UN agencies, which my colleague Michael Pelia from UNDP will briefly present to us. So Misha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And this presentation done by me from UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub. However, this is a product of joint work of UN system in Moldova, because it highlights some experience in IOM projects IOM-led project, PARI 1+1, and also UNDP project was funded by SDC, which is called MIDDLE. And remittances in Moldova, as Ben told, they're quite long-term, very high inflow of foreign cash into country. The issue is that this is a mixed blessing. On one hand, we have some very good opportunities. Poverty is going down, some private investments in health education, some secondary business starting picking up. However, we see also a lot of challenges, and these challenges related to stabilization and slight decline of remittances flow. So we're not sure how stable is this source. On the other hand, we have also some moral hazard, and which is, you could see youth unemployment rates are extremely high. So this is kind of mixed blessing. Remittances are mixed blessing. And the question is how we could mobilize these remittances for development purposes. And development challenges related to a couple of things. One thing, it's quite impressive when you look on total number of remittances coming to country, but you should understand two things about remittances. First of all, this is many small sums coming to very many families. So these money are very, very thin layer all across the country. Second, these money are coming with a tag. They are earmarked for consumption. And the question is how you could mobilize what is not tagged for consumption. And here comes the third thing, how this money influence local communities. Because many of them are just coming to country and immediately go out of the country because countries start importing a lot of products to satisfy local demand. And one of the big issues here is lack of trust. And I will be speaking about this, but when you start looking on trust in Moldova, any guess what is the most trusted institution in Moldova? No, but it's close. It's church, 80%. Who is next? Yeah, army is close. And what about next, after the army? Local public administration, 30%. Government, banks, all others enjoy something like 15% approval. So that's created a lot of issues when you try to mobilize remittances for something productive, because you cannot simply rely on banks, because banks are not trusted, and especially after this issue with 1 billion stolen from the country. So the big question is how we could engage local public administration in, together with migrants, to build better future for Moldova. And we have two examples. This first example is coming from a program called PARI 1+1, and it was led by IOM. It was funded by EU and implemented by specialized agency in Moldova, which is dealing with small and medium enterprise development. So the basic premise was we're dealing with complicated thing. We know what we would like to do. We would like to give a chance of people who are returning from abroad, who get some money through their very hard labor, to do investment in their business. However, we are not sure how to do this. There are many ways, and when you are dealing with complicated systems, there are many ways how you could do this. So in PARI 1+1 program, we were pretty clear where we'd like to go. We think that it's a very good idea to top up remittances with some public funds. However, we were not sure how to do this, and we worked quite a lot on localization, on contextualization of this approach. This approach worked in many countries. I think the starting point was Mexican program 1+3. However, it's pretty much depend how you do this. It's not just what you do, you top up, but also how you do this. And in this case, we work together with organization which related to development of small and medium enterprises. It was not just top up of money, but it was a lot of training for people who would like to do startup. It was a guidance how you could do business. And as a result, that's one example of the business we have. And we have relatively high number of women, something like 30%, 35% of people who benefited from this program are women. And we have some very good results. So we have something like 2,700 people who received training. They established 1,300 private companies. And I think what is quite important that we did very interesting math, that 1 + 1 = 3.3. Oops. It's 3.3 written there. But you could do this math from the other figures you could see on slide. We mobilized 35 million USD of remittances from people to invest in their local companies. And this sum was topped up by other sources of investment, which totaled to 50 million USD. So this shows us that it very much depends how you do things. It's not just have an idea, let's top up this money, but it also pretty much attention to details and working on local level, because these big policy things, they are really nice, but implementation matters. And with these things, we are going to the second thing, which is implemented by UNDP in Moldova, and it's called MIDL, Migration in Local Development. So here we are dealt with more complex system. We are not sure how things work. We are not sure why people don't trust government, and including local government. So we start creating opportunity for people to engage with local government and for local government to engage diaspora. So diaspora is a very big word, right? So everybody who left the country is diaspora. But we went a little bit different way. We start offering people a tool which we call Associația Baștinașilor. Baștinașilor, it doesn't mean simply migrants. That mean people who are coming from these localities. So we re-establish link with people with locality. And we focus on partnership. And one example how we dealt with it, we try to recreate trust. We try to recreate transparency. And we told, we are not for your money. We are not interested to get this money and invest it somewhere. We're interested in local development. And if you think you should do something in your locality, to buy a tractor to do a road, to buy some equipment to do local waste collection and processing, it's up to you. We just help you to set up this communication between local public administration and people who left country. So, and, oops. Yeah, and it was quite successful. On one hand, because we provided tools for people to engage. We were not so, all initiatives were not so reliant on us for implementation. So we show people how to do this, and people replicated this model quite quickly. So we created 38 these local hometown associations, but it was later replicated in more localities than we were engaged. We supported a lot of migrants, and that was a year when migrants started coming back from Russia because of economic crisis, and they lost the job and they started returning back. So it was a sort of crisis. And we got a lot of local projects, and again, we had very interesting math. We have a total value of local project of $2.5 million. However, diaspora contribution was very small. It was only 10% of this. Big part of this came from SDC, which funded the project, but even bigger part came from local public administration, because people in local public administration were also interested to do something good for their locality. And we simply offered them a tool how to do this. And this is a couple of examples how it could look like. This is a village of Chukuleni, where people invested in water. But we have many other examples, including of economic development project. And here you could see the split of funds which are coming from different sources. So, I think that's the last one, right? No. The big thing is how we could scale up. So now we're scaling up this project into new program called DAR, which mean you could have success in your country. And that's very good new initiative, which build on the lessons learned during our previous project, how we could mobilize this money, how we could leverage this money, how we could blend them to achieve some good results on local level. And yes, thank you very much for your attention. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Misha. All right, so the point is, this is a real example of blended finance. It's remittances from migrant households. It's local government money, it's national government money, and it's donors' money, making a real difference to people on the ground, and not lots of money either. And when we're talking about going from billions to trillions to gazillions to God knows how much, let's not lose sight of the fact that sometimes a little bit of money in the right time, in the right way, can really make a huge difference for people's lives. And I think we need to build on these examples and replicate them, not only in Moldova, but in other countries where we have significant remittance flows. Okay, it is now my pleasure to pass the floor to Mr. Bernd Leitner, who is managing partner of Land Berlin, a company that does credit guarantee funds in a number of countries, including Tajikistan and Afghanistan, as well as in Europe. So, Mr. Leitner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If I look at the many empty seats, I would say that those that are still here have very high expectations on what we have to say. I appreciate that, and I hope I can live up to the expectation. My name is Bernd Leitner. I'm managing partner of Land that is doing credit guarantees for SMEs in various countries. We manage guarantee funds, we establish them, we design them, and we provide consultancy. Currently in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Nigeria, Yemen, and soon in Egypt. How would that work? Okay, so what do guarantee funds do? They de-risk loans that lenders give to SMEs in this regard, using mobilizing using the liquidity that these banks or MFIs have. They address certain shortcomings in markets or obstacles for lending. Banks have liquidity often and don't use it enough for SMEs, so they mobilize the liquidity. They provide a substitute for collateral that customers might not have. In Afghanistan, 80% of all property is not registered properly in the cadastre and therefore does not have title deed. That means even wealthy people are not bankable. A guarantee fund substitutes that collateral that banks need with the guarantees that are given. They de-risk, obviously. Yeah, they share the risk that the banks have in these loans and therefore make the banks more willing to actually consider this. They deal with the lack or difficulties of enforcement in these countries because often the legal system is not designed sufficiently to serve that. And this was mentioned this morning a lot, technical assistance. They build, if combined with technical assistance, they build capacity with the partner banks and increase the lending skills that they have. Now, guarantee funds, we work in Afghanistan. It's probably one of the most difficult places to work with in terms of SME lending, but guarantee funds can be also used in very different contexts. And with this slide here, we are showing the relationship between the design of the guarantee fund, its intervention and its intensity of dealing with the banks, and the maturity of the market. Now in Afghanistan, you'll be on the left-hand side of this slide, so the maturity of the financial sector is low. That means you have to do individual guarantees, you have to make individual decisions, appraise the loans and all that. You need people on the ground. In Nigeria, for example, where the financial sector is much more advanced, we can work in a much more efficient way, working more with data, with portfolio guarantees, with less people involved and more system reliance on that. Furthermore, what is needed to make guarantee funds, obviously, capital. And here, and it was mentioned a couple of times today, the cooperation with governments, the cooperation with central banks in this regard, and the mobilizing effect of donors or investors is required. Now, what is the impact of these guarantees? For the banks, obviously it's a growth story. They help to increase their business, but they also help eventually to change the behavior of these banks, to understand that SME lending is a core part of their business, can be profitable, and can be pursued and integrated into what they do. In terms of the businesses, it's quite clear, it's access to finance, and access to finance with the needs, with the conditions that are commensurate with the needs. Maybe longer duration, higher amounts, less collateral, lower interest rate possibly. And for the stakeholders, it's quite clear. Central banks look for stability in the financial sector, and it's, at the end of the day, a story of inclusive growth of the private sectors. Now, in terms of capital, and the term of blended finance was used a couple of times, we'd like to explain a bit how this could work for funded guarantee funds. There are also unfunded ones. The US are using that, but not each issuer of guarantees has the standing like the US Treasury, so usually guarantee funds are often funded in order to generate the trust that the capital gives. Now, often, and in the countries that we work, where guarantee funds are often not so efficient, they are not really profitable. Across the world, guarantee funds are subsidized, openly or hiddenly, by counter guarantees from the states, by subsidies that are clearly given, by TA funding, by whatever means. Now, assuming a donor investment, a first loss tranche, for example, of 2.5 million, that could capitalize an investment of more commercial-oriented investors, DFIs or so, of 10 million. So with 12.5 million guarantee fund, and that relationship between these two might be different, and a coverage of 50% in this example, so each loan is covered by the guarantee fund with 50%, you can do a loan portfolio of 25 million. That, however, means that each dollar would have been used only once for this. Now, insurance companies work with the assumption that not every car that has an accident insurance will actually have an accident, and therefore they can use their money multiple times. So that leverage, assuming a factor of 5, or in financial terms, capital adequacy of 20%, would already build a loan portfolio of $125 million. But then you also have the revolving mechanism. Loans are being repaid, money that was booked for guarantees is being released again and can be used all over again. So over time, depending on the loan conditions and duration and so on, there will be a multiplier that could be quite substantial. So the story here is that for guarantee funds, they have been seen in general as cost-efficient tools, and they are market-friendly on top of that. Now we're talking about SDGs, and here is some examples of how this works. For example, in Afghanistan, we have established with the banks that we work with and the MFIs an environmental and social risk management framework, so that they have learned that environmental risk can become credit risk and therefore are dangerous. And they are now screening businesses to avoid these dangers. In Afghanistan and Tajikistan together, we have created more than 10,000 jobs and supported 60,000 jobs with the businesses that were guaranteed by us. And there are more examples here on this slide. One final point I would like to make, and we were talking about behavioral change of banks. Now, if the banks or the MFIs have understood that this SME lending is not such a risky animal as they would have thought initially, and they've learned to do the plain vanilla business of normal SME lending, let's say, Then it is the opportunity for the guarantee funds to push the banks more into more underserved target groups. Female borrowers were mentioned today a couple of times. Solar loans, we're doing in Afghanistan a pilot phase now. Startup, we are talking to KfW to establish a startup facility in Afghanistan, and so on. We call this the core satellite approach, focusing and creating volume with the core business and then going into satellites that are more challenging. Thank you very much for that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think the presentation you've just given us goes right to the heart of some of the issues the FAO presentation brought up. How to extend finance to underserved rural communities, to maybe some of the less productive agricultural households. You have to get the finance out of the capital cities. You've got to extend banking and financial institutions and financial instruments to less well-served areas. And credit guarantee funds are a way of doing that. De-risking some of this expansion. And it's a great way for donors and other financial institutions to leverage financial resources of other partners as well. So thank you for this great presentation and for calling our attention to this. I would now like to give the floor to Nil Memisholu from UN Volunteers, who will help us to remember that it's not only about finance, it's also about the human face. It's about things that we can all do as volunteers that can make a difference for the SDGs financing as well as otherwise. So, Nil, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
That mic should work.
Thank you so much, Ben. Distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to now, thank you. As Ben just shared, would like to take your attention, move it a bit to the important role of the volunteers, the citizens, the community work, and how we can actually benefit from the powers of the different stakeholders and bring it to the citizens' role in the society to reach the SDGs. I would like to give also show a PowerPoint presentation. So do I? Yes. So while giving some facts about the citizens' contribution to the SDGs, I want to give references, facts from the blueprint publication of UN Volunteers, 2018 State of World Volunteerism Report, that the thread that binds. So before going to now I want to ask you, the 5th biggest country in the world. I want to show you what is the 5th biggest country in the world by just from this map. The hand's supposed to be there on the last, however, it shows actually the volunteers. So let's continue. China, India, United States, Indonesia, and when we come to the 5th largest workforce country in the world, it is the volunteers. So 2018 SWVR presents the most comprehensive global estimates produced to date from national statistical agencies on data. And our analysis shows that 1 billion global volunteers whose efforts combined would make a full-time workforce of 109 million volunteers globally. So to put that into a context, as a country workforce, and we call our country a volunteeria, is three times bigger than the global workforce in financial services, and 4 times those employed in the mining and extractive industries. And I'm also pleased to highlight here that the volunteerism is presented as a renewable resource for peace and development. The importance of volunteerism in mobilizing financial resources has also been mentioned in Addis Ababa Action. And as acknowledged by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, volunteers are key stakeholders in the process of achieving the SDGs. They contribute to development efforts by providing their time and skills. So we've mentioned about the number, 109 million workforce. Although volunteers are recognized as a very important source and tool to achieve the SDGs. In many countries, unfortunately, the volunteers' efforts have still been not fully measured. And of course, there are some reasons to this. One main reason is the lacking of harmonized approach to the definition of volunteerism. And second major reason to this is actually the informal volunteer globally. When we look to the 109 million volunteers workforce, 73.3% of the volunteers globally are actually conducting their volunteer work informally, meaning they are not registered to NGOs. It's important to note, it's important to highlight this aspect. And also according to UNDP Human Development Report 2015, volunteering adds significant value to economies and societies, around 2.4% to the global GDP. And now let's look to a bit closer to the regional numbers. And according to the recent UN estimates, again in the 2018 report of State of World Volunteerism report, in the Europe and CIS region, there are 29 million full-time equivalent volunteers, making the region with the largest number of full-time equivalent volunteers in the world. And just to give some ideas, some evidences, Germany indicates 43.6%. One can assume significant difference in methodological approaches to measurement, of course, when we mention about the volunteer numbers. In Norway, it is above 70%, whereas when we look into Turkey, it is around 7.9% registered volunteers we are talking about. But it's also important to note that many of the volunteer activities are actually more costly when they are made by the government. Therefore, while the cost of volunteer activities is low, their contribution to the social and economical and human development goals is high. For example, in recent years, again examples from Turkey, many of the works on gender equality, women's rights, and environmental protection have actually been implemented by the NGOs. So, NGOs and the volunteers, and actually fall under the duty of the government, which are much more costly, as I mentioned. And few other evidences from the State of World Volunteerism report. In 2017, research commissioned by the State Department of Social Protection was carried out to determine that the contributions of volunteer work in Kenya, and the results are shared on the screen. Also, another survey result is from the Africa, Statistics South Africa, doing volunteer work, and according to that, it increased from 1.3 million in 2010 to 2.2 million in 2014. Now, as we mentioned, volunteerism is a cross-cutting aspect of the 2030 agenda, and UN volunteers with its 7,201 volunteers globally, this is the number of 2018 estimates, also serving for the SDGs. And in here I would like to share a few aspects with you. OECD notes that particular health and well-being impact for older and younger populations. For example, for older groups, volunteering can replace the social roles that have lost after retirement, increasing activeness and reduce isolation. Whereas in Australia, VNR included, the Volunteer National Review, included a subchapter called Volunteers for the SDGs as part of a whole Australian endeavor which estimated the economic and social contribution of volunteers approximately $290 billion per year. And Greece, on the other hand, notes that since the financial crisis, the number of volunteers has grown drastically to support the community's needs. And lastly, I would like to, so we talk about the importance of volunteerism to reach the SDGs, and we also I also mentioned that still there is a lot of lacking in measuring the value of volunteer contribution to the society. It's challenging to accurately summarize the regional trends across the region because there are, as I said, different diverse definitions of understanding of volunteerism. And these lack of robust comparative data make it difficult to measure. So therefore, we are suggesting a harmonized approach in order to have a comparable data. And second, in order to quantify the volunteers' contribution to the SDGs, countries generate democratic data, and which consists of people's involvement in the volunteer work by doing time spent and time of task performed, etc. To do this efficiently, statistical tools producing reliable and comparable data should also be developed. And perhaps in here, we can mention ILO and UNV's joint event, site event. They focused on the value and opportunities for integrating measurement of volunteerism. And feeding into this also 2011 ILO manual on measurement of volunteer work can also be shown as a good evidence, because in that report ILO presented a model, questionnaire model, and one very interesting result, not interesting for us, of course, but an important highlight says from Canada. Canada make a $400 billion contribution to the global economy, the volunteers in Canada. This contribution of volunteers make to the GDP more than of the agriculture and motor vehicle manufacturing industries. And one last important aspect I want to share with you, which is also related with the last bullet here, innovative with models for content of the national priorities. I want to give reference to the GA resolution 7340, adopted in 2018 December. It encourages all member states to invest in measuring the scale of contribution of people's voluntary efforts by also integrating volunteerism into the national strategies and to measure its impact on the implementation of the SDGs. And based on this, I want to share a good news that there is a 16% increase with the member states national review reports now mentions volunteerism. So there's a 16% increase with the acknowledgement. So based on previously mentioned facts and stated recommendations, the impact of volunteerism is undeniable, but the measurement tools needs to be improved to understand the value of volunteering work for the economy. Therefore, we need more evidence, and to measure the evidence, we need these recommendations to take place urgently. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. I would just like to add one point on volunteerism. I think if we sort of reduce it to its most essential level, volunteerism is people cooperating without the strong benefit of formal institutions, but relying on social capital and trust. And there are examples of this that are critically important when we talk about finance for the SDGs as well that weren't mentioned. And crowdfunding comes to mind. Crowdfunding is an increasingly important way of providing small but very timely sources of funds that can be leveraged by other sources of funds and can serve as a source of blended finance. And if memory serves, to go back to the Moldovan example, with the remittances, I believe part of the funds that came from diaspora organizations, either within the context of the UNDP project or the IOM project or perhaps other activities, came from crowdsourcing through the diaspora communities and local communities in Moldova. So there's another way in which sort of volunteerism and finance come together. And by the way, I should add that we're very grateful to IOM for their contribution to the presentation that Misha gave, and to Gennady Cretu as well from IOM. So this concludes the second part of the Partners Forum, which is the panel of partners, so to speak. And we would now like to turn, actually, before I do that, let me just turn to each of our partners and ask if you have any last words, since we have an extra little bit of time that you would like to add, hearing the other presentations or some other comments that have been made during the course of the meeting. Mikhail?
Thank you very much, Ben. Do you hear me? Yep. I would like to add a couple of things. One thing, we have some leaflets on the table, so you could pick up and see in more details what we did, and we also put some nice videos on the hashtag IDD 2019, so you could follow us on Twitter. Talking about our experience in Moldova, I think volunteerism play a huge role, because many association of diaspora was headed by pro bono presidents, people who are very much interested in local community development, who put some of their energy into doing things, and they did it for free. And we should not underestimate this. We cannot really put a price tag on this. And actually, if we start putting price tag on this, people most probably would reject to this, because they won't see this as a kind of enough compensation for them. But these people energy which glue together diaspora and local public authorities in getting good results and leveraging funds, it should not be underestimated. And it should be not underestimated in our case, because the thing which I presented was UN effort. It's not just UNDP, it's not just OEM, it's two different projects which worked into the same direction, addressing a little bit different issues, but with same mentality, with same approach. So UNDP had very good motto for human development. It's development for people, by the people, and of people. And I think it's very good motto even in SDG era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Ben, would you care to add something?
Yeah, yesterday we heard one complaint or one remark of one of our participants that SMEs were not touched during the conference. Well, I hope I could provide remedy for that. And we very strongly believe in the development impact that SMEs have. In general, for the economy, even our industrialized countries, SMEs provide the majority of employment, 60-something% in Germany. And guarantee funds are a very efficient, market-friendly tool to develop this SME lending in these countries. You might now think that, well, that's only needed for the very underdeveloped financial markets, but that's not true. You will find guarantee funds in the US, a very big SBA, Small Business Authority, provides that, in Germany and all the developed countries, because at the end of the day, there's always businesses that are too risky for banks to work with. In Germany, the guarantee banks, Bürgschaftsbanken they're called, around 1/3 of their portfolio is for startups. Well, banks can't do this because it's just too risky. Guarantee funds can step in here with the de-risking activity, even if the German banks don't necessarily need technical assistance that maybe Afghan banks do. So we live credit guarantees, and we believe it's a very important tool. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, just a quick follow-up question. When we talk about development of the tech industry, so often venture capital plays a critical role. And venture capital is not present in significant extent in many middle-income countries. Could credit guarantees play this role? I mean, clearly credit guarantees are a debt instrument and not an equity one, and venture capital is equity. But in terms of de-risking tech-relevant investments to accelerate some of the progress that we're looking at in these SDG areas?
I think indeed they could. You're saying credit guarantees are debt instrument. There's also equity funds that receive risk cushion from guarantee funds. So it is a feasible instrument indeed.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting. Nil, the last word.
Thank you. Well, in my presentation, I mentioned about many of the, in the previous years, the development projects that fall under the responsibility of the government being actually implemented by the NGOs and volunteers. So by taking this as a reference, perhaps we can take, I want to highlight this again, and maybe take the attention of the governmental institutions and private sector to more focus on the capacity development of the NGOs, and also create a more incentives and more enabling environment for the NGOs and volunteers in the countries, because the number of volunteers and NGOs being implemented high is not because of they have financially equivalent to this. It is not because of it. On the contrary, they are facing many challenges. It's just they have the will. So maybe we can invite the government and private sector more to support the NGOs and the volunteers. And lastly, I would also like to thank the volunteers, the UN volunteers, who involved in this event, IDD 2019 as well as IDD 2018. And they contributed their pro bono support. They are reporters here and supported the communications as well last year. Thank you, Ben.
Okay. Thank you, Neil. Okay, so now we've reached the third and final phase of the Partners Forum, open mic. Your chance to say whatever you have to say, hearing what we've said or thoughts that you brought with you about financing the SDGs. We have, I believe, already 2 people signed up from H&M that have something to say, but we have potentially time as well for others. So who would like to take advantage of the open mic? Please, we have one person. Excuse me. I'm going to jump down.
Okay, so yesterday we learned that the world is or will be short of $2.5 trillion of US dollars to implement the SDGs. And according to World Bank and other actors' estimates, by 2030, migrants will remit 6.5 trillion US dollars. So that's all directed to SDGs. So remittances are an important financing source. So that's also complementing the motto from billions to trillions. It seems that trillions are there already. So let's just not underestimate the remittances. These are not small money at all. Thank you.
Here, I would only add that if the overall sum is huge, it's just that most of the remittances themselves are very small, and there's a question of how to concentrate this and link it to other sources of funds. But of course, you're exactly right, and that's why for so many countries that are lower middle income, remittances are bigger than almost any other source of external development finance. And sometimes that's not fully taken on board as we think about development finance and financing the SDGs. By the way, I would add that there's only one reference to remittances in the SDGs and all of the 17 goals, 169 targets, and 230 whatever indicators. And that's a reference to the average cost of sending a remittance. It's supposed to be brought down to 3%. Well, that's great, it should be, but that's a very incomplete way of understanding the role of remittances in development finance. So anyway, you got me going on remittances, one of my favorite topics. Okay, we have some other speakers, please.
Ayşegül Çerçi, Development and Investment Bank of Turkey. I have 2 remarks. Actually, I want to introduce my bank to the audience as well.
Would you like to stand up so people could see you?
Development and Investment Bank of Turkey, Ayşegül Çerçi is my name. Our bank has been operational since 1975, but recently we have change in our mandates, and so our scope of operation and our instruments are broadened and diversified, and our mission is better aligned to Turkey's sustainable development goals. So we are focusing more on SDGs now at the moment. Although we are financing renewables, manufacturing industry, and tourism throughout the years, but now our focus is on SDG, and we are working heavily on IFI's funding. So we are meeting their reporting requirements, but now we want to improve and develop some kind of reporting on SDGs as well. So my takeaway from these 2 days actually as a development and investment bank, we need methodology, instruments, and some kind of practical ways of reporting SDGs. Because we are serving to achieve SDGs, but we don't report accordingly. I mean, in a way to promote and present our work in relation to SDGs. And another remark is, I think in the previous panel, I totally related to the development banking perspective because changing cultures in development banks from financing projects into the mobilizing finance for projects is so difficult. And we know from my personal experience and our bank culture, we need a change and maybe more discussion on that because that poses a question. Then why are we exist? I mean, why do we exist if we are not financing the projects directly? Then what is our use? But it is not the case anymore because no institution, no segments of financial services sector can do much alone. So we have to work together, and we will produce better results and achieve more all together, I think. So thank you. Thank you for this.
Okay, thank you very much. If I may, just building on what you said, there is a global trend now towards more and bigger national development banks in many countries, in many middle-income countries too, and not just for project lending, but for overall financial sustainability and stability of the country. Generally speaking, bank lending, of course, is pro-cyclical. And so if there's a downturn, banks stop lending and the downturn gets worse. And one of the few banks that have mandates to swim against the tide and provide more lending domestically when there's a downturn are precisely development banks. Now that can have an impact, of course, on the balance sheet and non-performing loans, but it can really provide an automatic stabilizer and minimize the damage to the financial system that happens when there's an external shock. So it's part of the resilience story of what we need to have with finance for sustainable development. So it's really great to hear what you have to say in Turkey. Microphone, please. No? Oh, sorry. Here it's coming.
In fact, we don't have explicit mandate as pro-cyclical duties and responsibilities, but it's more aligning the mission and vision, our mission with the Turkey's sustainable development goals. So that's
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next? Ah, yes. Rosemary, please.
Thank you, Ben. My name is Rosemary. I am the team leader for HIV health and development for UNDP Istanbul at the regional hub. I just wanted to take the cue from the submission for civil society. Just to let you know that as UNDP and working on health and development, we've been cognizant of the fact that funding, especially for HIV in our region, is dwindling. So we've been preparing countries as far back as 2015, 2017, especially countries that have been transitioning from the Global Fund to prepare them for domestic financing. And in that regard, looking at the role of civil society and NGOs, we've had an opportunity to work with 10 countries in the region, including Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Republic of North Macedonia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Montenegro, Serbia, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, going through steps of NGO social contracting to look at the space of civil society and how governments can work with civil society, looking at the legislation, the regulations, and making civil society as a partner for developing social services. So we are happy to launch a methodology and a tool that will help governments, civil society, and other partners who are interested in working with civil society to make sure we have that step-by-step tool to engage with civil society using legislation, but also for regulators to know to what extent they need to engage with civil society for social service delivery. So we have launched today that tool, and it's available on the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub. So if you go to our website, you will find the tool. So we are very happy that you included financing for social services, which indeed yesterday we heard that we need to be funding health like the way we fund infrastructure. If you fund health and development, you will realize more dividends, more incomes, and better development for countries. So I wanted to make that appeal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. We have another hand up here.
Thank you. So, Ben, we've been talking about...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, my name is Shams Mustafayev. I'm from Azerbaijan RCO office. So we've been talking about different accelerators of kind of, finding the cost of the SDGs. Now, this morning I read this article about Teresa Kachin-D'Amato, who suddenly unexpectedly became a chief in Malawi, and her first act was to annul 850 child marriages. That was her first act. First decision. So that reminded me that women get it. And that reminded me that maybe one of the accelerators might be that we finally demand businesses have women in the boards, have businesses, push businesses really demand that they at the decision-making table they have women and the senior management positions, that governments can do that. And that, to be honest, in civil service we have the same thing. Women don't usually make decisions. If we are talking about leaving no one behind, equality, and accelerating financing this, rural areas, children, malnutrition, early marriages, maybe we should really, really seriously demand to have women at the decision-making table. Thank you.
Hard to disagree with that. Thank you very much. Other comments? Okay, we're running a bit behind schedule, so I think we should conclude now and move towards the final concluding remarks of IDD. So please join me in thanking our panelists and all of you who have contributed to the Partners Forum for your remarks and contributions, and looking forward to coming back next year and hearing what you have to say then. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I think it's been a productive and long two-day conference. I think we've had, 4 speeches, more than 7 panels, all very exciting. I think we're coming to the end. I'd like to invite the manager of UNDP's Istanbul Regional Hub, Gerrit Torgerman, to deliver some closing comments to this year's Istanbul Development Dialogues. Gerrit? Yeah, can we get a mic? Or are you going to speak from the podium? All right, there you go then.
Thanks very much. Indeed, it's been a long 2 days. I'm glad to see that the rows are still quite filled. A couple of words on behalf of Mirjana Spoliajo-Egger, our regional director, who would have loved to be with us right now, but she couldn't make it back to the Marriott on time. So she asked me to say a few concluding remarks, bringing together these rich 2 days. We heard over the last 2 days from governments, from the public sector more broadly, from the private sector, from international financial institutions, from our companies, corporations, think tanks, civil society, investors and investees around the issues on putting money to work for the SDGs, for sustainable development. We talked about instruments, mechanisms, how they mature and evolve, how they gain in size and access, the need for transparency around it. We talked about risk, impact, accountability around instruments and tools. We talked about leadership, a key issue that came up in almost all of the sessions, the importance of leadership in making these, or in realizing the big ambition that sits behind the SDGs, the issue of political will, the issue of coordination and concerted action, of long-term approaches rather than the short-term type of thinking that often drives our way of working. And then I think importantly, we talked about what I would, I guess, almost call framing the 2 days of discussion. We talked about the need for culture change, for changing behaviors, for changing attitudes, for working in a very different manner. That's always easily said. That's much, much harder done. And it takes a long, long time if I compare that to the urgency that sat behind the keynote speeches, that sat behind Sean's closure yesterday evening. Culture change will have to hurry quite a bit in order for us to make sure that we still meet the challenges that we've been talking about. But really fully summarizing those 2 days is a very tough one. And this is, as Alichan kept reminding us, this is dialogues. So what I'd like to do much rather is hear from you in one word or one sentence, your main takeaway from these 2 days? How useful was it? What stands out for you in your recollection? There's a lot of food for thought, a lot of food for action, and I guess some of us are still, or should I say, digesting, to stay with the picture. So if you're still in that digesting process, don't hurry too much, but if something is on your mind in terms of an immediate takeaway, why don't you just share it with all of us? Can I ask for immediate gut reactions of what stood out for you? What are you taking home from these 2 days? Limia, please.
Thank you, Gerd. Let me kick it off. Limia El Tayeb, for those who don't know me, I'm from UNDP Albania. I think what I'm walking away with is this notion that there's a lot of money out there. We're just not tapping it, and we're not directing it to those most left behind. So let's find ways of creating partnerships and de-risking it enough for the investors to reach the farthest behind first. So for me, that's the main takeaway.
Very good point. I think partnership, I should have added, it was one of the framing elements that came through all of the discussions. And I should add again, the Istanbul Development Dialogues for UNDP are not a UNDP platform per se. It's meant to be a platform of all partners coming together on key issues. The partnership that sits behind the platform and that is actually demonstrated in your presence here is very important to us, each and every of the partners that are here assembled in the room. Other key takeaways, thoughts? You can even say, look, I didn't really learn anything in those 2 days. I anticipate all those outcomes from the start. Nothing new from me over the last couple of months, and not from these 2 days. Too many mics behind.
Thank you. Milovan from Serbia, governance. I'd say comprehensive approach in order to tackle all of these, issues related to sustainable development. It's obvious that, some enabling factors have to be addressed, like good governance issues, rule of law, and things like that, which should be packaged together with, with sustainable financing strategies.
Very good point. In fact, it reminds me back to Sean's summary last night, which demonstrated the interconnectedness that we sometimes tend to kind of not emphasize sufficiently. When we talk about climate change, how close that is to governance, how close that is to gender equality, to inequality more broadly, to all of the other topics that are covered through the SDGs. It's a very interconnected agenda to tackle. Thanks for that comment. Other takeaways, thoughts? One common takeaway that I can see across the room is that I feel rather tired, if I can put it this way, but that's also part of the journey. If you were not exhausted right now, then you hadn't participated fully. There's one over there, please.
Hello, my name is Sharifa from TICA, Turkish Coordination and Cooperation Agency. It's the National ODA Implementing Agency. My main takeaway is that green investments are becoming as important as social investments with social impact, because with no livable environment, no investment will bring results to us. So that's the main focus that I took as a takeaway today.
Thanks very much for adding that. I think that's an important point also from the perspective that a lot of the discussion around finance tends to be around financial gains in this discussion. The emphasis led by the banks and by some of our speakers on the non-financial gains that investors are looking for was also quite an interesting and illuminating part of the discussion. And good to have Tika in the room. Thanks for being with us. Anybody else? Dima over here, and where are the mics? Over there. We'll start here and then we'll come to you, Dima. Just one second.
I'm Dima from UNDP Moldova. My takeaway is, you know, with all the diversity of the different mechanisms, the different opportunities, I think we need to have the government takes a leading role in enabling and optimizing the benefit from this, and that we are here collectively to support and provide the technical support for that. But I think we also need to enhance that support so the governments are in the driver's seats. Achieving the SDGs is, at the end of the day, the national development agenda. And that's also the role of the national stakeholders, the national actors, be it government and be it others. But it's extremely important that they are in the driver's seat, and that's our responsibility. It's not only about the numbers, but it's also the impact and how this is, affecting their growth and whatever it takes to accompany them with that.
Thanks. That reinforces the point on leadership very strongly, absolutely.
Natia Natslishuli, UNDP Turkmenistan. My takeaway is following. Of course, we need financing for achieving the SDGs. There are finances available out there. Furthermore, there is a wide variety of instruments that have already been created, that are being created, and will be created in innovation spirited out there, and it is important to keep abreast of all of this. It is important to know what's happening elsewhere. It's important to try to have this kind of the evolving context and the developing context, and trying to bring this all to the use and utility of achieving the SDGs. So congratulations for the successful event. Looking forward to the continued discussions.
Thanks very much. In a way, a point that also is directed back to UNDP. With our global presence, we have to make sure and get much better at sharing global best practices. Shombi, please.
Hi, Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator in Armenia. And again, just join the colleagues in expressing appreciation for this really important discussion and really taking us to the next level of development thinking. My point would just be very simple, that and this is maybe a little bit self-serving, apologies for that, but focusing on the issue of coordination at the country level, obviously. We see so many different actors coming with so many different perspectives, and I think when we had the IFI panel, for example, it really came to mind. In Armenia, we've launched a pretty robust, call it donor coordination process together with the government, and there it's quite interesting because you see the spectrum of it's not just about financing gaps or understanding gaps, but it's about pushing the policy needle in the right direction, working with governments to incentivize. Some development partners, are very assertive in that space. For example, the EU partners have direct budget lending with, policy matrix and this sort of thing, more for more types of policy financing. Other partners, some IFIs, for example, ADB, spoke here, and I see that as well, kind of more on a project basis, not necessarily looking at, budget support, that type of financing. So if you have a good, solid, robust coordination process at the country level, I think that's where you can really maximize this partnership sort of approach.
Thanks very much, Shombi. If I imagine the UNDP administrator in his opening statement commenting on what you just said, I would think that he would talk to us about being much more issue-focused than project-focused at the end of the day, also in terms of how we build the broader coalitions and ecosystems of partners, but an extremely important point on coordination. Thanks. Have I forgotten anybody? Please.
Olaf Jurgensen, UNDP Regional Hub. I was really pleased to see how, this is a very vanilla statement, financing the SDGs like it's just one problem, and to hear how, peeling back the onion, the context, the issues of fragility, as we heard from the Lant presentation, that this is more complicated, the issue of scale and geography, urban versus rural, and then rural versus rural, urban versus urban. I mean, within pockets of poverty that exist all over, that whole, the issues of green bonds, brown bonds, blue bonds, that was really nice to hear, that we didn't have just a simple solution to something that's supposed to be indivisible, and we're all told these 17 things all hang together. The solutions, like you just said, Gad, you know, we need to be penetrating from many different perspectives to get at it, because it's the how. If we meet a year from now, you know, what will we learn? How will we carry this dialogue forward? So to me, it was exciting to hear that there are issues of fragility. We didn't discuss much about Africa, obviously, because this is taking place in Istanbul, but the challenges there are different than the challenges here. And I think there was a recognition of that. I was happy to hear about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Olaf. Indeed, Istanbul is not Africa, but certainly as an Istanbul regional hub, we have the ambition of going much more global in our debates and dialogues. So bringing this more to the fore in the coming dialogues, I think that will be part of our ambition. Any final word from around Rosemary?
I think I've learned that SDGs are an expression of smart public investment in 2020, 2030. And I still ask myself, 2020 is next year. How will financing SDGs in a smart way look like in 2020? How will financing SDGs look like in 2030? So I've learned quite a bit about financing SDGs, and I hope all of us feel that responsibility to actually use this platform of SDGs as smart investment.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. If I don't see, there's one more comment on the side, and then we'll conclude.
Hello, I'm Osman from Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, known as TICA. First of all, I'm very grateful to listen presentations and just meet people around the world. So it has been a great experience for me. But I would like to focus on the commitment that we are promising to fulfill. Not SDGs, but in general, just solving the problem of the world. It is 0.7% of ODA over GNI, official development assistance ratio, but we are still fall behind that. And the governments are not, holding their promises, and they're not fulfilling their commitments. And we appreciate that we have some kind of, financing instruments called as PPP, or some kind of let's say developments in terms of developing tax base, but commitments are not fulfilled yet. So governments are still responsible for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Osman. No final word anymore. It allows me to come to them really to the end, but bear with me for 2 minutes, because this is the moment of an event like this that really needs attention, because it's also a moment that I really take some pleasure in, because it's a moment of big thanks to quite a number of colleagues and teams and people who have helped us make the IDD possible the way we conducted it. So first of all, a big thanks really to all of you for being with us, for staying through the 2 days fully with us. It's been a filled and loaded agenda overall. A big thanks to all the speakers and moderators, and to Alijan as our Master of Ceremonies. Thank you very much. We'll come to a big applause at the end, so just bear with me for a moment so that I can go through a lot of thank you with all of you. To the many colleagues and teams who made this possible in UNDP, we had Ben and George and their teams, Mara, Berna, Anka, Ivan and their teams, Asli and Ilknur, Ekaterina and Farid, Nico, Mehmet, Karen and their teams on the communication side, Ezra, Begum, Elis, Pavol, Yunus and their teams on technical related issues. There's a whole big machinery behind it of teamwork that made this work, and I really want to pay full tribute to all of the colleagues who contributed to this. This includes, of course, all the rapporteurs, the UN volunteers who helped us make this happen from a rapporteuring perspective, the technical teams, Apex, the interpreters, the hotel here with its services, and all of you, I should add once more. Last but not least, and very importantly to us, as you can also see on the logos that underpinned our event, the partnership with the government of Turkey is absolutely essential for us to make these type of dialogues happen. Their continued support has been absolutely marvelous to us throughout the process. So with you jointly for all of the names that I just mentioned, rather than individual applauses, let's give them one big hand all together, please.